They sent a legion. She returned them in pieces. Part 1. The stars outside the window did not move. They never did. But Nora Hayes had spent enough years in space to find them calming, the way some people find rain calming, or fire. She was sitting in the captain's chair of the Iron Meridian and staring at those stars and not sleeping, which was something she had gotten very good at over the past 3 weeks. The ship was quiet. It was always quiet now. There used to be 43 people on board. There were 11 left. The corridors felt too wide. The mess hall felt too empty. Nora had stopped eating in there and started eating at her station instead, which was not good for her, and she knew it and did not particularly care. Outside, floating in the dark, maybe 200 kilometers away, was the wreckage of Caldwell's Reach. It used to be a colony. 22,000 people, farms, a school, a small market district with a cafe that served terrible coffee. Nora had been stationed there for 2 years before the Varek came. She knew the smell of the place. She knew the sound it made in the morning when the wind came off the eastern ridge. Now it was just pieces, metal and rock and silence. Nora turned away from the window. Danny Cole was at the communications station. He was 22 years old and from a small city in California and had wanted to be a music teacher before the war started. He had ended up in signals training almost by accident. Now he was the only person left on the ship who knew how to run the comms board, which meant he sat there every shift looking slightly too young for everything that was happening around him. See, Vera Okafor was in the engine room. She was almost always in the engine room. Nora could hear, faintly through the ship's ventilation, the sound of Vera humming something old and slow. Vera was 48 and had grown up in Houston and had been keeping machines running her entire life. She did not talk much. She did not need to. The Iron Meridian was still flying, and that said everything. Theo Grant was at the weapons console, running checks on the rail cannon for the 4th time that day. Theo was 35, and quiet in the way that people are quiet when they are very focused. Before the war, he had competed in long-range rifle shooting. He was extremely good at it. Nora had never once seen him miss anything he aimed at. The other 7 crew members were resting or running maintenance. Nora knew all their names. She knew where they were from and what they had done before the war and what they were afraid of. A commander should know those things. It made the responsibility heavier, but Nora had decided a long time ago that lighter was not the same as better. The alert came at 0340. It was not a sensor alert. It was not a weapon lock. It was a signal, broadcast on every frequency at once, so strong that it cut through the Iron Meridian's damaged filters and came out of every speaker on the ship at the same time. The voice was flat and translated and inhuman. But the words were in English, which meant the Varek had bothered to learn it or had bothered to make a machine that could speak it, which was somehow worse. The message said that the Varek Dominion had accepted the surrender of Earth's Joint Defense Command, and it said that all remaining military vessels operating under an Earth flag had 48 standard hours to stand down and present themselves for processing. It said that any vessel still operating after that window would be destroyed on sight. It said there would be no second message. Then it repeated, and repeated again. Nora listened to it 3 times. The crew was all awake now. They had gathered in the corridor outside the bridge without being called, drawn by the sound of the broadcast, the way people are drawn toward a fire even when they know the fire is dangerous. Nora could see them through the open hatch. Danny was still at his station. Vera had come up from the engine room with a wrench still in her hand. Theo had not moved from the weapons console. They were all looking at Nora. She understood what they were waiting for. Or they were waiting to find out if this was over. They were waiting to find out if the weight they had all been carrying for 3 weeks was about to be set down. She could see it in their faces. Not hope exactly, but the shape of the place where hope used to be. Nora stood up from the chair. She said, We are not surrendering." Nobody said anything for a moment. Then Vera said, "The port engine has about 3 good burns left in it. Maybe 4 if I'm generous." Theo said, "I have enough rail cannon rounds for 2 serious engagements, 3 if we're careful." Danny said, "I'm picking up a Varek scout fleet on the long range. 30 ships. They're about 18 hours out." Nora nodded. She had already known most of this. She had been sitting in that chair doing the math for 3 weeks, running the numbers every way she could think of. Looking for the version of this situation that made sense. She had found one. It was not a comfortable version, but it was real. She said, "Good. Then we have 18 hours to get ready." She told them what she had been planning. She told them about the debris field, how she had spent the last 2 weeks mapping every wreck and every shadow and every blind spot in the remains of Caldwell's Reach. She told them how they were going to go dark and make the Iron Meridian look like part of the wreckage. She told them where they were going to hide and what they were going to wait for and what they were going to do when the Varek scouts came looking. She talked for about 20 minutes. When she was done, she looked at her crew. Danny said, "So we're going to fight 30 ships with 1 rail cannon and a broken engine." Nora said, "Yes." Danny thought about it for a second. Then he nodded, the way young people nod when they have decided that the person asking them to do something difficult probably knows what they are doing. Vera went back to the engine room. Theo went back to his checks. Danny turned to his console and started running the frequencies, looking for more information about the approaching fleet. Nora sat back down in the captain's chair and looked at the stars. 22,000 people, farms and schools and a cafe with terrible coffee. She was not going to make a speech about it. She was not going to explain herself to the Varek or to the galaxy or to anyone. She was just going to make sure that the 48 hours they had been given ran out on her terms, not theirs. The Iron Meridian sat quiet and dark at the edge of the debris field, and Nora Hayes sat at its center, and she waited. Vera turned off the engines at 0200, and the Iron Meridian went completely dark. Not just dark the way a ship goes dark when it powers down for the night. Dark the way a stone is dark. No heat, no signal, no movement. Vera had stripped every non-essential system down to nothing. The life support was running on a tiny backup loop that produced so little heat signature it barely registered on their own internal sensors. The navigation lights were off, the comm array was in passive-only mode, listening but not speaking. They had positioned the ship between 2 large pieces of wreckage, the gutted hull of a colony transport called the Meridian's Hope, which was almost funny, and a section of the old orbital platform that had come down in pieces when the Varek hit it. From the outside, in the dark, the Iron Meridian looked like a 3rd piece of debris. Just more broken metal floating in a dead field. Nora stood at the main viewport and looked at the wreckage around them. The debris field was enormous. Caldwell's Reach had been a significant colony, which meant it had significant infrastructure, which meant that when the Varek destroyed it, they created a very large and complicated field of floating wreckage that was full of sharp angles and broken reactor cores and random electromagnetic pulses. Nora had spent 2 weeks learning that field the way you learn a room you have lived in for years. In the dark, by feel. She knew where the pulses came from. She knew which wrecks blocked sensor signals and which ones amplified them. And she knew the spots where a ship could sit invisible and the spots where nothing could hide for more than a few minutes. She had picked their current position very carefully. "At 0600, Danny Cole said quietly, "I have them on the long range. 30 ships, standard Varek scout formation. They are entering the outer edge of the field." Nora said, "Good. Everyone stay still." The Varek scout fleet was commanded by a young officer named Drevok. Nora did not know his name at the time, but she would learn it later from intercepted transmissions. Drevok had never lost an engagement. He was considered promising by Varek standards. His commanders had sent him here because they did not expect this to be difficult. 30 ships against one old frigate with a broken engine was not a battle. It was an errand. Hadrevok brought his fleet in using a standard search sweep, which was the correct procedure. His ships spread out in an even formation and began moving through the debris field, scanning for active power signatures and engine heat. They were thorough and professional. Nora watched their movement on the passive sensors and said nothing. She watched them for 2 hours. She watched the formations spread out as the ships tried to navigate around the larger pieces of wreckage. She watched the natural gaps open up between vessels as they took different paths through the field. She watched, and she calculated, the same way she had been calculating for weeks, running numbers in her head without writing them down. At 0831, she saw what she had been waiting for. The 3 Varek ships had separated from their nearest support vessels by a significant distance. They were on the far side of a large section of the old orbital platform, which meant the rest of the fleet could not see them clearly. The gap would last approximately 90 seconds before the formation adjusted. Nora said, "Theo." Theo Grant said, "Ready." Nora said, "4 shots. The 2 on the left first, then the lead ship, then whatever target you think is best." Theo said, "Understood." Nora said, "Vera, we need engines in 5 seconds after the first shot." Vera said, from the engine room, "Already warming." Nora said, "Fire." The rail cannon was not a quiet weapon. It made a deep, heavy sound that went through the whole ship when it fired, more feeling than noise. It fired 4 times in 11 seconds. The first shot hit the leftmost Varek ship directly. The second shot hit the one beside it. Both ships came apart fast and clean. The third shot hit the lead ship and punched through its forward section. The ship did not explode, but it stopped being a ship. The fourth shot caught a fourth vessel that had been moving to respond and crippled its engines. Then Vera lit the engines and the Iron Meridian moved, sliding sideways through the debris field, going dark again before the Varek fleet could triangulate the source of the shots. The next 8 minutes were the most careful of Nora's life. She guided the ship through the wreckage by memory and feel, using short engine bursts that lasted no more than 3 seconds each, staying behind the larger pieces, changing direction constantly. The Varek were fast. They had reacted quickly and were already spreading out to search, but they were searching for something running. The Iron Meridian was not running. It was hiding. There is a difference. Nora found a new position, a gap between a collapsed cargo container and the broken spine of a mining vessel. And Vera cut the engines again. The ship went dark. They sat and listened. Outside, the Varek were shouting at each other. Nora could not understand the language, but she could hear the tone in the transmissions, even translated into noise, confusion, alarm, something very close to panic. Over the next hour, the Varek attempted 3 more sweeps of the area. Each time, the Iron Meridian was somewhere different, somewhere quiet, somewhere that looked like debris. Each time the Varek thought they had found something, they found a wreck. By 10:30, the Varek fleet had lost 7 ships. 4 more were damaged. Drevok called a withdrawal to the edge of the debris field. Danny Cole let out a very long breath. Nora heard it and almost smiled. Theo ran the numbers without being asked and reported them to Nora in a flat, even voice. 7 ships destroyed, 4 disabled, 0 human casualties. The rail cannon had 11 rounds left. The port engine was still holding. Vera came up from the engine room. She had a burn mark on her left forearm from a cable that had sparked during one of the engine bursts. She did not mention it. She sat down on the floor beside the engineering station and drank from a water container and looked at Nora. Nora said, "What did Drevok report to his commander?" Danny had already been working on this. He said, "I can only get fragments." But he used the word coordinated, and a word that translates as multiple vessels. Nora thought about this. Drevok had looked at what happened and decided that no single ship could have done it. So he had invented a fleet to explain it. He was not wrong to think it was impossible. He was just wrong about why. She said, "Good. Let him think that. She turned back to the viewport. The debris field was quiet again. The Varek were at its edge, licking their wounds and filing reports. Somewhere in that fleet, a message was being sent to the War Master. A message describing a coordinated ambush by unknown human forces in the Caldwell debris field. A message that would reach the most powerful military commander in the Varek Dominion and make him pay attention. Nora did not know his name yet either, but she would. Vera went back to the engine room and started humming again. The Iron Meridian sat dark and quiet in the wreckage and waited. The War Master came himself. Nora had expected this, eventually. When you take 7 ships from a scout fleet and make the survivors report a coordinated ambush by multiple vessels, you create a problem that is too interesting to leave to junior officers. Sooner or later, the person at the top of the chain would want to see it for themselves. His fleet came out of transit on the far side of the system, and Nora counted them on the passive sensors, while Danny read the numbers out loud. 300 ships. It was the largest single military force the Varek Dominion had deployed against one opponent in 200 years. Danny said the number a second time, quietly, as if he was not sure he had read it right. Nora said, "I heard you the first time." She already knew his name by then. Intercepted transmissions over the past week had given her enough fragments to piece together that the commander's name translated roughly as the one who ends things. Other species in the galaxy called him Vakrath, which was easier to say. He was old by Varek standards. He had destroyed civilizations. He did not lose. Nora sat with this information and then set it aside, the way she set aside most things that she could not change. She had other problems. Vera came up from the engine room with a look that Nora had learned to read over the past month. It was not a panicked look. Vera did not panic. It was the look Vera got when the news was bad and she was going to deliver it plainly because that was the only useful way to deliver bad news. But Vera said, "The port engine is done. I have kept it running with things I am not proud of, but it is done. We have 2, maybe 3 high-speed burns left before it fails completely. After that, we are on 1 engine." Nora said, "How long to get us 1 engine burn if we needed it right now?" Vera said, 20 seconds. Nora said, "Good." Theo reported that the rail cannon targeting system had developed a fault in its alignment sensor. He had repaired it using 2 pieces of salvaged Varek hardware and a firmware patch he had written himself at 3 in the morning. He said it was working. Nora believed him. The hull, Vera had mentioned the previous day in a separate conversation, had stress fractures along the starboard side from the debris field operation. Not immediately dangerous, but not good either. Vera had described the overall structural situation as ambitious, which was Vera's word for things that should not be working, but were. Nora walked the ship that evening. She went compartment by compartment, the way she had done every few days since taking command, checking in, talking to people, being present. The crew was tired. They were all tired in the specific way that people get tired when they are afraid for a long time. Not sleepy tired, but worn down tired. The kind that lives in your joints and behind your eyes. She talked to each of them. She did not give speeches. She asked about the things they were working on. She listened. She made sure they ate. There was one other thing she needed to do. She called Danny to her station and told him about the neutral observer vessels. There were 3 of them, sitting at the safe edge of the system, far from the Varek fleet. They belonged to species that had been watching the conflict from a careful distance. They were not human allies. They were not enemies. They were the kind of observers that powerful interstellar civilizations send to watch things that might be historically significant. Nora had been thinking about them for days. She told Danny she needed him to take the shuttle, the small, unarmed transport that they used for short-range crew transfers, and go to those vessels and ask to speak to their captains. Danny said, "Alone?" Nora said, "You are the best communicator on this ship." Danny said carefully, I am the only communicator on this ship. Nora said, "Then you are definitely the best one." Danny thought about it. He was scared. Nora could see that. Oh, but she also knew that Danny Cole, under the fear, was someone who got up and did things anyway. That was the kind of person he was. She had watched him do it every day for a month. He went. While Danny was gone, Nora set up the second ambush. The Varek fleet had to pass through a transit corridor to reach the inner system. The corridor was not optional. It was the only navigational path through a dense region of gravitational interference. Every ship, no matter how large, had to slow down and align carefully to get through it safely. Nora did not have enough rail cannon rounds to fight 300 ships directly. She did not have enough of anything to fight 300 ships directly. But she did not need to fight them. She needed to slow them down, cost them ships, and make the galaxy watch it happen. She had 7 derelict automated cargo drones that had been drifting in the area since the fall of Caldwell's Reach. They had no weapons. They had no engines. They had very small power cells that still functioned. Nora had Vera modify those power cells to produce, when activated, a sensor signature that looked almost exactly like a small active vessel. Nora positioned the drones across the corridor and set their timers. When the Varek advance element entered the corridor 2 days later, the drones activated one by one. The Varek fleet saw what appeared to be a line of small human vessels. They opened fire. The corridor walls reflected energy weapons back at strange angles. Nora had known this. The Varek had not checked. 4 Varek ships were hit by their own reflected fire. 2 were destroyed. The remaining drones were blown apart by direct hits, which was expected. No humans were in the corridor. Danny came back from the observer vessels with red eyes and steady hands, and reported that the captains had listened to him without interruption for 2 hours. They had not promised anything, but they had done something that surprised both Danny and Nora. They had quietly forwarded the sensor data from the Caldwell engagement to their homeworlds. Unofficial, unattributed, just data, moving through channels that the Varek did not monitor. Someone was watching. Someone was paying attention. Nora noted this and said nothing more about it. Vera fixed a new fault in the secondary coolant loop that same evening. She did not tell Nora about it until it was already fixed. Nora found out anyway, the way she found out about most things on the ship, and went down to the engine room. Vera was sitting on the floor beside the repaired section, drinking water, humming something low and slow. Nora sat down beside her. They sat there for a while without talking. Eventually, Vera said, "We are running out of everything." Nora said, "I know," Vera said, "except you." Nora did not answer that. She did not think it was entirely true. She was running out of things too. She could feel it, the slow drain of sleep and food, and the ordinary comfort of a world that was not on fire. She was managing it. She did not know for how much longer, but she knew what she was doing it for. She had known since Caldwell's Reach. The names were still there, clear as anything. Pat Lund, Grace Morales, Keith Allen. She got up and went back to the bridge. Vakrath's fleet was still coming. The call came at 0500. It was not a broadcast this time. It was a direct transmission addressed by name to Colonel Nora Hayes of the Iron Meridian. The frequency was one that the Varek knew the ship could receive, which meant they had been listening to her communications long enough to map her systems. Nora told Danny to open the channel. The voice that came through was different from the automated broadcast of 3 weeks ago. It was still translated, still flat in the way that machine translations are flat, but there was something behind it that was not machine. Age, maybe. Or the specific kind of weight that comes from having made very large decisions for a very long time. Vakrath said he had reviewed her record. He said it in a simple, direct way, like someone reading a report. He said she had destroyed or disabled 37 Varek vessels. He said she had done this with 11 crew and 1 frigate. He said that approximately 490 Varek soldiers were dead because of actions she had taken, and that not one of her own people had been killed in any engagement. He said, "This cannot continue. You understand this?" Nora said, "I understand." There was a pause. She could hear faintly the background sound of a large ship, its systems, its hum, the tiny noises that large metal structures make when they are in space. Vakrath said, "Then why?" It was a genuine question. Nora had been in enough conversations to know the difference between a question someone asks to delay or to confuse and a question someone asks because they actually want to know the answer. This was the second kind. She told him about Caldwell's reach. She did not start with strategy. She did not start with numbers or politics or the fate of the human race. She started with a man named Pat Lund, who had run a small cafe in the colony's market district for 11 years. She said his coffee was the worst she had ever tasted and that he knew it and apologized for it every single morning and then made it exactly the same way the next day. She told Vakrath about Grace Morales, who taught at the colony school and also ran a youth athletics program on weekends because the colony did not have a budget for a separate athletics coordinator, and she did not think that should mean the children went without. She told him about Keith Allen, a structural engineer who had been trying to get funding for a repair to the eastern water cistern for 18 months. He had finally gotten the approval 2 weeks before the Varek arrived. He had been very happy about it. She said, "These people are dead, not defeated, not relocated. Dead. You made them dead. Call it strategic necessity if you want. Call it absorption. It does not change what it is." Vakrath was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "You cannot win." Nora said, "I know. I am not trying to win." She said, "I am trying to make sure you never forget what you paid." On his command vessel, Vakrath sat with this for a long time after the transmission ended. He had a staff of analysts and advisors, and he did not consult any of them. He pulled up the record of every engagement the Iron Meridian had been involved in, and went through the sensor logs himself, step by step. And the way he had gone through battle records early in his career when he was still learning. He was looking for the pattern. There was always a pattern. What he found was not a pattern in the military sense. It was something else. The attacks were patient. They were intimate with the terrain in a way that only came from living inside a space for a long time and paying close attention. They were designed not to win, but to cost. Every engagement calculated to take something from the Varek while spending as little as possible of what the Iron Meridian had left. It was the fighting of someone who knew they were going to run out of resources and had decided that running out slowly, on their own terms, was the point. Vakrath wrote a note to himself in the margin of the battle record. He had been writing battle notes for 50 years. He had never written one like this. He wrote, "This is not a military engagement. This is a message. We have no counter-strategy for messages." He sent 100 ships to take the Iron Meridian by force. Nora was not where the Varek expected her to be. She was not at the listening post she had been using as a relay. She was not at any of the debris field positions. She had moved 2 days earlier, which was not unusual. She moved constantly, never staying in one place long enough to become findable. She was sitting in the shadow of a small moon on the far side of the system, in a position that required knowing the moon's exact rotation schedule and the specific angle at which its mass shadow created a sensor blind spot. Nora had worked this out with a pen and a piece of paper at 3 in the morning a week earlier. The Varek search was thorough. They had good equipment and competent people, and they searched the system in a methodical pattern that should have found anything that was running. The Iron Meridian was not running. It was sitting, dark, breathing slowly. It took the Varek 6 hours to find her. Nora had been counting on those 6 hours. Vera had spent them preparing the ship's last spare reactor core as a shaped electromagnetic pulse device. It was not a weapon in the traditional sense. It did not explode in a way that destroyed things. It released a burst of electromagnetic energy at a specific frequency that scrambled navigation and targeting systems within a certain radius. When the Varrock closed to within range, Nora triggered it. 31 Varrock ships went blind simultaneously. Navigation scrambled, targeting offline. The weapons locked in their last commanded position. 90 seconds. Theo Grant fired the rail cannon 17 times. He did not miss. 11 Varrock ships were destroyed or critically damaged. Then Nora pulled the Iron Meridian out of the shadow on the one engine that was still fully functional and moved away before the Varrock could recover. Behind them, the port engine made a sound like something tearing and went offline completely. Vera said from the engine room, "Port engine is down. We are on one engine." Nora said, "Can you fix it?" Vera said very quietly, "I don't know." Nora said, "You've said that before." Vera said, "I know. I meant it this time." Nora turned back to the viewport. The Varrock were far behind, recovering, counting their losses. The galaxy was watching. Danny had confirmed it. The neutral observer vessels were still relaying data, and the data was still moving through quiet channels to worlds that had been watching the Varrock absorb civilization after civilization and saying nothing. Someone out there was doing the math. Nora sat in the chair and thought about Pat Lund and Grace Morales and Keith Allen. Then she got up and went down to the engine room to sit with Vera while Vera worked. Nora called the crew together in the common area. There was not enough seating for 11 people, so Vera sat on a toolbox, and one of the younger crew members sat on the floor and nobody mentioned it. Nora stood at the front of the small room and told them the truth, which was what she always did. She said, "We have fuel for one more high-speed transit. We have 12 rail cannon rounds. We have one functioning engine. The hull has cracks in it that Vera has described as fixable with creativity, which is the most concerning endorsement I have ever heard. We are 11 people." Nobody laughed at that, but a couple of them almost did, which was something. She said, "This is the last engagement. We go in, we hit Vakrath's command vessel as hard as we can, and we get out if we can get out. If we cannot get out, then we make sure the galaxy sees what we did. 11 people and one ship and 37 Varrock vessels. That is real. That happened. Nothing takes that back." She looked around the room. She did not look away from any of them. She said, "Nobody has to agree with this, but I am asking you." There was a moment of quiet. Not the uncomfortable kind. The kind that happens when people are deciding something honestly. So Theo Grant said, "I'm in. I'd like to see what 17 shots looks like from their side." Vera said, "The engine will hold. I made sure of it last night." One by one, the others said yes, or nodded, or just looked at Nora in a way that meant yes. Danny Cole said, "Can I call my mother first?" Nora said, "Use Vera's channel. Take as long as you need." Danny took 11 minutes. When he came back, his eyes were red, but his jaw was set and his hands did not shake when he sat down at his station. Vera gave the engine a final check. Theo ran his targeting calibration. Nora sat in the captain's chair and looked at the viewport for a while. Then she said, "Let's go." The Iron Meridian came out of its hiding position at maximum speed. Nora had calculated the approach vector for 3 days. It was not the vector a military computer would recommend, and it was not the safest or most efficient path to Vakrath's command vessel. But it went through the densest part of the Varrock formation, which meant the Varrock ships on either side would have to hold their fire to avoid hitting each other. She was buying herself 9 seconds. Theo Grant used those 9 seconds very well. The rail cannon fired. The shots went exactly where Theo aimed them. Vakrath's command vessel lost its primary weapons array in the first 2 hits. The communications tower came down with the third. The ship listed but did not break apart. Nora had not wanted it to break apart. She wanted Vakrath inside it, alive and aware, knowing exactly what had just happened. The Varrock returned fire as the Iron Meridian pushed through the formation. 3 direct hits. The starboard hull cracked open in 2 sections. Vera sealed them remotely in 4 seconds without being asked. The secondary engine threw fault alerts. The ship was shaking in a way that ships are not supposed to shake. Nora said, Vera said, I see it. Give me a minute. Danny opened the broadcast frequency. Nora had thought about what to say for a long time. She had thought about speeches, the kind that get remembered, the kind that people quote later. She had decided against them. The moment did not need decoration. It needed truth. She said, My name is Colonel Nora Hayes of the United Earth Defense Corps. This is the Iron Meridian. We are 11 people. The Varek Dominion sent 1,000 ships to end humanity. We are still here. They are missing 37 vessels. We are not asking for help. We are not surrendering. We are telling the galaxy what a human being is. So that you know when you have to decide what to do next. She closed the channel. Vera said, Nice. Nora said, Get me back on one stable engine. Vera said, 20 minutes. It took her 18. The Iron Meridian limped out of the Varek formation and made for the outer system. The Varek did not immediately pursue, which Nora had not counted on, but which made a kind of sense. Vakrath's command vessel was dark. His fleet had just watched 11 humans fly through the middle of 300 ships, kill his communications, and fly out the other side. The formation was in the specific kind of confusion that happens when the thing that was supposed to be impossible turns out to be real. On his damaged bridge, in the quiet of a ship that had just lost its ability to communicate with its own fleet, Vakrath read the incoming signals on a secondary console. There were 7 of them. Not military signals. Diplomatic signals. From 7 separate civilizations that had said nothing, done nothing, watched the Varek absorb world after world for decades, because the Varek were too powerful and it was not their business. One transmission was long. It was from a civilization called the Ethoran Collective, and it had been watching the sensor data from every engagement for 3 weeks. It said it had been wrong to stay silent when other civilizations fell. It said it no longer believed that resistance was pointless. It said, plainly and without drama, if one ship with 11 people did this, we want to know what an alliance does. 2 more transmissions said nearly the same thing in different words. Vakrath sat with this for a long time, and he had come here to end a nuisance. He had created instead the first serious anti-Varek coalition in 2 centuries, built out of the wreckage of one human colony and the refusal of one human woman to stop. He could continue the campaign. He could press forward and eventually destroy the Iron Meridian and complete the absorption of Earth, and it would cost him more ships and more soldiers and more time, and at the end of it, every civilization that had sent him a message today would have made their decision. He ordered a full withdrawal. He did not explain why to his officers. He did not need to. The Iron Meridian drifted in the outer system, while the Varek fleet turned and left. The crew watched it happen on the sensors in silence. Theo counted the departing ships. Vera ran damage reports. Danny received a reply from his mother and read it 3 times. 3 months later, Nora Hayes stood in front of the Galactic Common Council in the same uniform she had been wearing since Reston Station. She had refused a new one. The council was made up of the oldest and most careful political minds 12 different civilizations had produced. They asked her questions for 4 hours. Most of the questions were the same question in different forms. How did you do it? Nora answered all of them the same way. She told them about Pat Lund and the terrible coffee. She told them about Grace Morales and the children she coached on weekends. She told them about Keith Allen and the water cistern that he had finally gotten the funding to fix. She did not give them a formula. She did not offer them a strategy. She made them understand what she had been fighting for. One name at a time. After the session ended, the Ethoran representative found Nora in the corridor. She was very old, slow-moving, and her translator gave her voice a low, steady quality. She said she had watched civilizations fall for 400 years and had never seen what she watched Nora do. Nora asked, "What did you watch me do?" The Athoran said, "You made the dying matter." Nora thought about Pat Lund. She thought about Grace Morales. She thought about Keith Allen. She thought about Danny calling his mother and Vera on the floor of the engine room humming something old and slow. She said, "Yeah, that's the idea." She walked back to the Iron Meridian, which was docked in a maintenance bay that 6 different species had offered to help repair. Vera had accepted their help on the condition that she approved every component personally. Nora sat down in the captain's chair, not Alan Price's chair anymore. Hers. She looked at the stars. Then she slept.